Hello, and welcome to another episode of Balanced Body Radio. I'm your host, Casey Ruff, and today we have another amazing guest to introduce you now. Gary Taubes is an award-winning investigative science and health journalist. Taubes is the author of several critically acclaimed books, including Good Calories, Bad Calories, Why We Get Fat, The Case Against Sugar, and The Case for Keto. Taubes is the only print journalist to have won 3 Science and Society Journalism Awards given by the National Association of Science Writers. He has contributed articles to the Best American Science Writing 2002 and to the 2000 and 2003 editions of the Best American Science and Nature Writing. Taubes' 2002 New York Times Magazine cover story, What If It's All Been a Big Fat Surprise, caused a big stir in the ongoing fat versus carbohydrate discussions. Through his research, Gary Taubes shakes up our preconceptions about diet and health, and he challenges scientific studies that have been misinterpreted and prescribed as advice for the general public for years. He offers instead new ways to eat, live, and think about health based on the highest caliber of scientific research. Gary Taubes, what an absolute honor it is to welcome you to Balanced Body Radio.
Thank you, Casey. It's a pleasure to be here.
It's an absolute honor to be able to interview you. You're somebody who I followed for a very long time. I actually put out a tweet a few weeks ago just to ask everybody on Twitter, like, who got started in the low carbohydrate world because they came across one of your articles, one of your books, or one of your presentations. And there was quite a few people, as you would imagine, that have come to this world because of you and your work. So pretty cool.
Yeah, it's interesting. I like to think, well, this is immodest, but I like to think that a lot of the people who came through other people's work don't realize that those other people came to their world by reading my book and that 2002 New York Times Magazine article. So there's a sort of, but then I was building on a lot of other people as well. So there's a long train going back.
Sure. We're all standing on shoulders of other giants for sure. That's great. I was able to be a guest interviewer on a podcast that we both did with Professor Chris White on the Connected by Controversy podcast. And you revealed one of your favorite snacks on the Connected by Controversy, the cold bacon with butter. If I traveled back and told you that you knew a person who's eating cold bacon and butter, what would you think of their current health assessment at the time?
They're probably dead. I still worry about that. As I said on the podcast, there's a level of, once you go down this road and you stop believing in the argument that saturated fat is bad for us, causes heart disease, naturally occurring saturated fats. It just opens up a whole world of possibilities for what you can eat that we've all kind of been raised to think are deadly. So the carnivore diet is one extreme of that. Is just these people living on meat alone. And even in my research for my first book, Good Calories, Bad Calories, it had been clear that was possible, but clear that populations, human populations, had done that for millennia, and yet the idea that people eat that way is still like, clearly they must be killing themselves prematurely somehow. It's just not normal. So yeah, bacon and butter. I'm never gonna live that down, and yet it's delicious.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, you're still here and you look as good as I've ever seen you. And definitely one of our listener questions actually was what you do in your personal life to stay healthy. Are you lifting weights? What do you do to stay healthy?
What do I do? Well, I eat what I think is a healthy diet, right? Again, that's controversial, but I follow it pretty religiously and I'm very happy eating that way. As far as exercise goes, I had torn my cartilage in one of my knees playing college football freshman year in college in 1973. And I had that cartilage removed the year before arthroscopic surgery came to Boston. The next year, my best friend tore his cartilage. Same surgeon did arthroscopic surgery with me. Back then, they used to just cut basically remove the entire cartilage. It was 6 weeks in a cast and 6 months in physical therapy. And then everyone who got that surgery ended up with chronic degenerative arthritis because you had no cushioning in the joint at all. So I haven't been a runner for 20 years because of that knee. And then about 3 years ago, I had that knee replaced because it finally seemed worth getting rid of. And now and the knee replacement didn't go all that well. So all I do a lot of body weight exercises, pull-ups, plank push-ups, kettlebells, and I hope someday to get back to swimming regularly, but I've been working on a book on diabetes, and it keeps me so busy that actually leaving my house to go out and go to the local pool and go swimming seems to take up too much time. But I keep swearing that when I finish this book, which I hope will be within the next month, I will go back to swimming regularly. So.
Wow. Well, we certainly hope that's the case, but knowing you, you'll probably start your next book, which we also talked about a little bit on that other podcast. So hopefully there's a gap.
Yeah, no, knowing me, they probably will continue being a bit. I'm a workaholic. I've always been. And when you write for a living, it's hard to escape the cycle of feeling that you should always be at your desk. It's not healthy psychologically, but nonetheless, there's always work that has to be done. So
yeah, it's just in the blood, sounds like.
Yeah.
Well, we certainly are appreciative of all the things that you've written. I do want to focus a little bit on your latest book, The Case for Keto, which I found to be absolutely fascinating. And you made a few really key points in there that I don't think has ever really been made or touched upon. And I know you've talked about the subject so much. And I would love to talk about some of the points that I came across in the book that I thought were super fascinating. The first one really is how you addressed the audience in The Case for Keto. And you use specifically the phrase, those of us who fatten easily. And I'm curious, why did you decide to make that distinction and write the book for that population of people, and who does that include?
Well, when you think about it, and I've done nothing but think about it for 20 years now, the conventional dietary therapy for the past 100 years is basically derived from the way that lean people eat and exercise. So if you're lean and you maintain a healthy weight relatively easily, you assume that everyone could do the same if they did exactly what you did. So what you end up with, and what's happened in this country, well, in the world, is that we've ended up, lean people tend to assume that it's relatively easy to stay lean. It is for them, and they assume they eat in moderation and exercise in moderation. And if everybody ate in moderation, everybody would remain lean. So we get this weight loss, sort of the idea of Michael Pollan encapsulated in his mantra, eat food, not too much, mostly plants. The not too much means if we just eat not too much, we will remain lean. And what people never realized, some obesity researchers did 100 years ago, and then this was kind of lost in the history of the field, is that people who gain weight, those of us who fatten easily and those of us who don't, might be sort of different types of people. So if those of us who fatten easily try to eat like lean people do, but it fails. Some of us, there are people out there who have never tried to hold back their appetites, who have never tried to eat less or go the day avoiding snacks and treats and skipping desserts. I'm assuming there are people out there who just eat whatever they want. But for the most part, everyone tries to eat less if they're gaining weight. It's a kind of a natural phenomenon. You start gaining weight, you try to fight it. But for those of us who fatten easily, it fails, and we have to eat differently than lean people. So this idea is we've been getting lean people's diet advice, which works for them, but doesn't work for us. Virtually all of the diet advice we get, even in the huge epidemiologic studies where they determine what healthy people eat. So they look at people who are lean and healthy, and then they follow them for 20 years, say. This is like the nurses' health study at Harvard, which is the most famous. And after 20 years, you look and see who's remained lean and healthy, and you look at what those people eat compared to the people who have gained weight. And you find that the people who remain lean and healthy tend to eat fruits, vegetables, and whole grains, and not too much of it, and legumes and all the other diet advice you've been given. And that's what you tell everyone to do, assuming that if the people who gained weight did that, they would have remained lean also. And then the argument is that's not the case. The problem is, some of us just put on fat easily, the way some breeds of animals fatten easily and some species of animals fatten easily. a metaphor I like is you can imagine the world as, there are greyhounds and there are basset hounds or mastiffs. And the greyhounds go around thinking if they could just get the basset hounds to run around a track like they do, the basset hounds would look like greyhounds. And they don't. When you end up, if you run a basset hound around a track a few times, you don't end up with a greyhound, you end up with an emaciated, exhausted basset hound. It's like our predisposition to gain weight or not tells us what we have to eat if we want to fight it. And then it, comes down ultimately, if I'm right, to carbohydrates and the carbohydrate content of the diet.
Yeah, interesting. You do such a great point talking about these studies that are done, and what you're talking about, that that study is when you ask people what they eat, you start to make assumptions based on a food frequency questionnaire, which right off the bat, they're so horrible. If you've ever seen one, it's like, check how many times you have eaten either a full apple or half a can of apples, once a week, once a day, twice a day. Like, it's absolutely ridiculous. And then to make conclusions from that, you just absolutely can't do that. It's not possible, right?
Well, that's true. But even if they could, this is what the epidemiologists don't like people like me to say, even if they could, they would have, this is when you hear this argument, association is not causality, or association does not imply causality, or the people who really don't understand this will say association does not necessarily imply causality. It just never does. So here's an example. Imagine you were studying, again, physical activity is easy to imagine. You could imagine that people who are dying of cancer are completely inactive, right? They're bedridden. So you can measure it perfectly. These people don't move. The people who are not dying of cancer are walking around, exercising, but there's no causality there. It's not like the people are healthy because they're exercising and the people who are dying of cancer are lying in bed because they're not exercising. It's sort of, you never know what's cause and what's effect, and what else that you're not looking at might be influencing what's cause and what's effect. So even if you could measure our diets perfectly, you don't actually get causal information from that data. What you learn is what healthy people eat, not why they're healthy. And you learn what unhealthy people eat. So even you go back to the 1980s, there were studies showing that people who tended to be, suffer from obesity or overweight, at least reported that they ate less sugar than people who were lean. Well, if you're lean, you can drink a Coca-Cola, right? First of all, nobody criticizes you for drinking a Coca-Cola if you're lean. And second of all, if the Coca-Cola isn't making you fat, then why not drink it? They happen to be delicious. If you're overweight or obese, or you're struggling with your weight, then you shouldn't be drinking Coke. You should be drinking it, nothing else, Diet Coke. So you've got what's called reverse causality. Because you're gaining weight, that's changed what you consume in such a way that you're trying to stop it. But when you do these studies, you don't see any of that. All you see is that back then it was lean people consume more sugar than people who struggle with their weight, or at least they report consuming more sugar. It's possible that people who struggle with their weight don't want to admit that they're having dessert and drinking 3 Coca-Colas a day because they kind of think that people will judge them based on that. If you're lean, you never get judged on what you're eating, right? So you're also going to report what you eat differently because you're not worried about people, making assumptions about your willpower or your character. So these studies sort of on a very profound level can't do what the nutrition research community has been trying to make them do. And they're kind of aware of that, but simultaneously, they also know that if they acknowledge it fully, then they put themselves out of business and render meaningless their entire careers. And most of us aren't capable of acting in that way.
Yeah, no, it's such an important point, and it's important for people to understand that, because that's not what shows up on the headline. Like, if you want to dig through a study, you'll find that stuff and you'll learn this stuff eventually. But it's that headline that just grabs people's attention and says that red meat is bad for you or causes cancer, or all the different claims we hear. Every few months it seems like a new headline pops up. And again, you can dissect the studies, but not many people do. They just see the USA Today headline and go all in.
Not only, it's sort of worse than that. I just had a friend, let me see if I could find this. and just about a half an hour ago, an article from The Guardian, which is, a British paper that's very thoughtful and has some terrific writing and terrific reporting. And the headline was, "Vegan diets are healthier and safer for dogs, a study suggests." And this is written by their environmental editor. I mean, it's crazy. And what these people do is they survey dog owners and they ask them what they write and what they feed their dogs. And it turns out that people who feed their dogs vegan diets tend to assume that their dogs go to the vets less often, and they have less health complaints about their dogs. So therefore, the survey suggests that vegan diets are healthier. That's the headline. That's the gist of the article. The guy who wrote the article has already decided that meat consumption is bad for the environment and meat consumption is bad for our health based on other similar studies. So the problem is, you imagine that you have ethical issues with consuming animal products, which I completely understand and can relate to, and admire people who can live by that ethical standard, which I can't. So you've changed your diet, and now you're feeding your dog, which is at best an omnivore and is descended from carnivores, a vegan diet. And you could imagine 10,000 people start feeding their dogs vegan diets, and after 5 years, 2,300 of them, the number in the study, are still feeding them vegan diets. The other 7,700 found that their dogs were not thriving on these diets and went back to feeding them what they had fed them all along because the dogs didn't do well. But now when you do the survey, the only people who are still feeding their dogs vegan diets are the ones whose dogs are still healthy. Then there's also if your dog isn't healthy on the diet and you keep your dog on the diet, you're not a very responsible pet owner. So there's a strong dynamic to drive you away from the diet if your dog does not happen to be thriving. So you have no idea what the risk-benefit analysis really is. You only have this snapshot of the people who are still feeding their dogs vegan diets and are reporting that the dogs are healthy. Because there aren't that many people who are going to report, "I'm feeding my dog a vegan diet and it's like lying on the floor twitching, and hasn't had a bowel movement the last 47 times I took it for a hike," or anything like that. On the other hand, they will report when the dog is doing well. So there's a selection bias in that way. You simply cannot. The only way to establish this kind of information in any kind of reliable way is to do a clinical trial, a randomized trial where you take 5,000 pet owners with 5,000 dogs and you randomize 2,500 of them to eat a vegan diet, 2,500 of them to eat a equally healthy diet that has animal products in it, and then you follow them for a few years to see how the dogs do, and you'll learn something meaningful. And the fact that the Guardian's environment editor doesn't understand this is profoundly depressing from a science journalism point of view. I mean, wow. I'm stunned that somebody who's gotten to the point of being like an editor at the Guardian would write up data like this, and yet it gets published. So the counter argument is, who's Taubes? Why should we believe him? The PLOS, which is a relatively well-respected journal, published this article. Therefore, they must know better than I do. It's a crazy world.
Wow, it really is. That's insane. I mean, you talk about in your book, all these nutritional authorities and how they failed us over the years. And one of those ways that we talk about that they have failed us is the equation that most of us know, which is calories in, calories out. I see it every time I pass a Coca-Cola vending machine. We've already mentioned them a few times, so hopefully they can monetize our podcast. Maybe they'll be a sponsor. That would be great. But every time you pass the vending machines, it says balance what you eat, drink, and do. And we talk about the calories in, calories out equation as a great way to lose weight. So people need to exercise, 250 calories more a day. They need to eat 250 calories less every single day. That's 500 calories difference. If you did that for 7 days, that's 3,500 calories, which equals 1 pound. So you just do that until, you have weeks that have run out because you've lost all the pounds you needed to lose. And you make an excellent point in your book about the difference. If we're looking at that equation, the difference over the course of 10, 20 years, if somebody is over consuming their their energy expenditure by just 20 calories. Can you explain the point that you were trying to make when you're talking about such a teeny tiny amount of calories? If that balances off, how somebody can become obese?
Yeah. Okay. So this is, and by the way, this is in reading the medical literature. I first saw this discussed in a textbook called Basal Metabolism in Health and Disease that was published in, I think it was 1924. So first edition by Eugene Dubois, who was then the leading metabolism researcher in the United States. So this is like the seminal textbook in metabolism and disease, published in the 1920s. And he points this out. This is in the first paragraph of the book. So we think about, in order to maintain a healthy weight, we have to balance our intake to expenditure, and we measure that by calories. And he says, that means, for instance, if I maintain my weight, like I'm, I don't know, 210, 215, I maintained it now, that's pounds for, 10, 20 years, I'm maintaining my weight to effectively balancing intake to expenditure perfectly. Because if I'm off by 1%, so I eat 3,000 calories a day, I don't know, 2,500 calories a day, 1% of that would be 25 calories. And if I store that 25 calories as fat, then we do that same calculation you did. Let's make it 20 calories because it's easily. So you take those 3,500 calories, you divide it by 20, and you find out that you're gaining about a pound of fat a year every half a year. So it's 2 pounds of fat a year. It's a very simple calculation. And there's no assumptions involved, no assumptions about how much of the energy you eat is burned up in exercise or is burned, transformed by the gut microbiome or is not digested as fiber. You're just saying, look, if every day I store 20 calories as fat, 1% of what I eat is stored as fat, I'm going to gain 2 pounds of fat a year. Or conversely, if I'm gaining 2 pounds of fat a year, that means on average, I'm storing 20 calories a day. So the chapter on why we get fat, my second book, there was a chapter called 20 calories a day. If you store 20 calories a day for 10 years, that's 20 pounds, right? If you do that for 20 years, that's 40 pounds. So you're overshooting by 1%. Now, we don't actually have technology that could measure energy balance by 1%. They didn't in 1924, which is the point Dubois was making, that you needed to accurately match intake to expenditure better than any technology that existed then. And the technology hasn't really gotten any better in that way. It's just a very hard measurement to make. And yet we're supposed to be able to pull this off. And when people talk about theories of obesity, and the conventional wisdom is the reason we get fat is because the food environment dysregulates our ability and our brain to match intake to expenditure, to sort of trigger the necessary compensatory effects in our body so that if we eat more, we expend more, and if we expend more, we the idea that that can do it to perfect accuracy is sort of insane. So you go back to the 1920s, 1930s, when some very smart researchers were writing about this, they were saying, look, the question isn't why do some people get fat in this food environment? Because we all eat more food than we probably are programmed to eat. That's all of, the whole artistry of cooking is about making the food taste better than it would if you just, killed a deer and didn't even have the opportunity to burn it. And then on top of that, you've got cocktails and beer and desserts and snacks and all these other things. So all of us are clearly getting more food than we might eat otherwise. Why is it only some of us get fat and some don't? How do the ones who stay lean if they're the way the job is supposedly done by this matching of intake to expenditure? So that's the kind of way, just asking those questions. And in the Case for Keto, I talk about this. I mean, it's just, these are not the kinds of questions that obesity researchers ever ask. In fact, if you ask them in an interview, so I was a journalist, I like to think I'm still a journalist. If I ask someone these kinds of questions in an interview, they'll kind of be insulted. Like, how can you ask me a question? And I'll say, well, this is, let's pretend this is a science. That's my favorite phrase. And in a science, you're supposed to identify sort of concepts that don't make sense and probe them. And this one just on a very profound level doesn't make sense. All you have to do is ask yourself, how am I possibly going to avoid not putting 20 calories, 1%, how can I possibly match my intake to expenditure? And I have no idea how much I'm expending, so it's a little crazy.
Yeah, we need your friend, nephrologist, Dr. Jason Fung on the line right now. He's obviously an intermittent fasting expert. He's a kidney specialist, written books about diabetes and cancer. If he was on the line right now, we could use some of his snarky sarcasm to say, like, do you think the body is so stupid? Like, of course the body's going to figure out 20 calories a day. It's going to regulate that. You don't need to overthink it. The body's not that stupid. It's kept us alive for hundreds of thousands of years. So
this is what's interesting. When I'm reading this book I'm writing this book on diabetes. So when you're writing about diabetes, you're basically writing about metabolism and physiology. And I got obsessed with the history of this. So it's a kind of case study in the history of the science of diabetes and diet. And you find time and again, beginning in the 1860s, like 150, 60 years ago, people asking this question: how does the human body maintain a constant internal environment when it's not eating? So remember, we were talking about what happens, you store 20 calories a day. If you're overeating by 1%, or if you're storing an extra 1% of the calories, what if you're not eating at all? Okay. What if you're fasting? What if it's your body continues to maintain a pretty constant internal environment? By that I mean blood sugar stays the same. You tend to you shift from burning fat, so that you shift to burning fat for fuel, so that you don't burn muscle for fuel. After a few days, you lose, for the most part, a sense of hunger. So your body's clearly evolved to adjust to no food at all. And then the question is, how does it do that? And then what happens, and why is it that in this particular modern era in which we live, there are people whose bodies cannot maintain either, have trouble controlling their blood sugar, and have trouble controlling their blood pressure, and have trouble controlling their weight, though all those things go together. And then you start looking at the physiological explanations for that, instead of this idea that we just eat too much, which has always been the conventional wisdom. We just, for whatever reason, some of us eat too much and some of us don't.
Yeah, that's super interesting. A lot of, kind of what happened with nutrition and the guidelines and all these things that have come out since the 1960s, we kind of attribute to Dr. Ansel Keys, a pathologist from the University of Minnesota, who kind of had the diet heart hypothesis in the 1950s and 60s and kind of made that be the thing that everybody was talking about before it was really proven. But before he did, before he had that message, he really did a starvation study, speaking of calories, which I thought was fascinating that you went into in such detail in your book. And one of the things that really struck me was when you think of somebody doing a starvation study, which guaranteed you can't do that study anymore in 2022. I would assume like that was our one chance to be able to do a study like that. But the calories, speaking of calories, the calories that he was putting people on were, according to you in the book, like 1,500, 1,600 calories. Right. That's like, there's a lot of people that are eating far less than that every single day today. Like, are people just walking around starving all the time on that many calories?
Well, you raised two issues here. One of them is, so Keys does this study. This is the early years of the Second World War. And the idea is the Allies at some point are going to liberate Europe, and we're going to get to Eastern Europe, and there's going to be famine is going to be a problem. So the idea is to study the conditions of famine and to understand how to refeed people after you've liberated them, so that you don't cause more problems than they're living with at the moment when you make food available. So this was the purpose of the study. He gets, I think it was 33 conscientious objectors, and he puts them on the semi-starvation. They call it a semi-starvation diet, which is about 1,600, 1,700 calories a day, which is about half the calories these people were eating naturally then. And these people are all young men, mostly lean. A few of them were what we would call overweight today. They were sort of typical for the era, which was an era when people were mostly lean. And the gist of the study, when you ask the question, what happens when I semi-starve people, is they manifest the symptoms of semi-starvation. So they're hungry all the time. They lose weight, although not that much. I think if I remember correctly, it was about 12 pounds in the first couple months, and then they slowed down to about a half a pound a week or something like that. They were obsessed with hunger. They thought about it all the time. They thought about eating all the time. Some of them, took to chewing gum constantly as a way to satisfy their hunger. They dreamt about food at night. They fantasized about cookbooks. One of them tried to mutilate himself to get out of the study, and then successfully did. I think cut off a couple fingers with an axe while he was cutting wood, so he could get out of the study. When they let these subjects, conscientious objectors, leave the compounds, they had to send them out and with buddies to assume that they wouldn't cheat and eat while they were gone. And then when they refed them, they found that they just gained weight back with sort of remarkable speeds. It was like their bodies just sucked the calories, the fat back into them, and they ended up fatter than they had started, with more fat tissue on them originally. So one of the interesting issues is when people over the decades, people have always known that ketogenic diets work. Low carb, high fat diets are very effective for weight loss. And the assumption has always been that if people eat these diets, the reason they work is because they just eat less. So then you have to ask the question, why is it when people were semi-starved, eating 1,600 calories a day on what was considered sort of the quintessential Eastern European diet? In retrospect, it was a low-fat, low-calorie diet with a lot of plant products, so it was mostly plants. Why is it when you fed them, conscientious objectors, that in the 1940s, they were starving and thinking about food all the time, but nowadays the weight loss advice given to overweight and obese people is to eat a diet of like 1,200 to 1,500 to 1,800 calories, and you wouldn't expect them to be starving all the time just because they start out overweight instead of starting out lean. Physiologically, why would you expect it to be any different? And then when they do lose weight eating a ketogenic diet and they're not hungry, how can that be possible if they would be starving if they were eating this sort of relatively healthy Eastern European, mostly plant diet? So there's a lot of issues that come up with this, but a lot of the reasons I raise this, these are questions that this research community just never asked. They got onto this idea that had always been around, this idea that overweight and obese people just eat too much, that's the cause of it. When you read the medical textbooks going back to the 19th century, some of them would say, look, clearly some people eat too much and that's why they get fat, but other people don't eat a lot at all and they get fat also. So maybe there are two different kinds of people here, or maybe there's something we're missing. And then in the 1930s, they start to embrace this idea that everyone just eats too much. And once they do, you're turning obesity, this disorder of fat accumulation, into a character defect, right? Eating too much is a behavior. So, and the guy who was responsible for this shift, a University of Michigan doctor named Louis Newberg, very much saw it as a behavioral issue. He blamed this ultimately on ignorance, or, I forget the other, I forget the quote, but he very much saw it as a character issue. So you end up with this theory of obesity, basically since the 1930s, that's a theory of why people eat too much. And then the assumption is that's why they get fat and that's all they study. Anyone who can't maintain their weight one way or the other is seen as a character defect. A lot of the modern science of obesity researchers, a way to try and explain why people might get fat because they eat too much, but not blame them. So you can blame the industry for making ultra-processed foods that just taste too good. But this whole idea that maybe they have this sort of fat accumulation disorder, that it's literally some kind of hormonal, metabolic, physiological defect that makes them want to store fat. The same way someone who's got a tumor in their pituitary gland might grow to be 8 feet tall, and he's got a growth disorder, and guaranteed this person is going to be very hungry and is going to eat a lot of food, but you're never going to blame it on that. You're going to blame it on the oversecretion of growth hormone. So maybe fat accumulation is also due to an oversecretion of a hormone or some kind of dysregulation of this hormonal system. And that's what I talk about in all my books, ultimately.
Yeah, well, that's what I love about your work. It's not just that you're kind of poo-pooing this idea that people have, but you're also presenting a different, case, the case for keto. It's a different alternative that seems to explain things so much better. So for the listener who this might be new to, for somebody that's been counting calories, can you basically describe what you're proposing as the true reason why people gain so much weight and why those hormones are so important?
Yeah, so from the 1930s, and again, I got into this. My obsession is the scientific process, and actually, I'm more obsessed with when it goes wrong. So the pathology of science, when it goes off the rails. All my books have been about this. So from the 1930s onward, there's also a revolution. Just as the obesity people start to think that obesity in everyone is caused by eating too much. People studying fat metabolism and fat storage start elucidating what regulates that. And they need a variety of new technologies and assays and ways to measure. So it develops over the course of 30 years. And by the mid-1960s, it's clear that the hormone insulin, is a principal regulator of fat storage. So every hormone to some extent will affect fat storage, that balance of the 20 calories that we're talking about that you might store in excess all day, because hormones are telling your body to do something, flee or fight, procreate, eat, sleep, get warmer for the cold weather, sweat. I mean, they do everything. They're the signaling molecules the primary signaling molecules in our body. And because they're telling your body to do something, they tell your fat tissue to release fat into the bloodstream so that fuel will be available for this thing you're going to do. And actually, it's kind of cool in the 50s, researchers, when they finally could measure, it's called fatty acids in the bloodstream, they realized that if they gave animals or humans adrenaline, their blood would fill up with fat, because the adrenaline is telling them, again, to flee or fight. That's your primary response hormone there. And it's making the way they saw it is it's making the fuel available. So like if you see a lion and you get this burst of adrenaline, and you're going to run away from the lion, you'll have enough fuel available immediately to continue running long enough to survive, basically. So that was the idea. The one hormone that works opposite to that was insulin. So insulin was a hormone that you secrete in response to mostly eating carbohydrates. Insulin is secreted in response to your blood sugar going up in your blood. And it turns out that there are a lot of different ways that insulin is the way it was phrased in this famous 1965 lecture was the principal regulator of fat metabolism. So basically, when insulin goes up, it's telling your lean tissue and organs to burn blood sugar. You secrete it in response to your blood sugar going up. And high blood sugar is toxic. So the insulin is telling your cells, basically, look, burn this blood sugar, just take it up, burn it, let's get rid of it, we got to keep it under control, blood sugar is rising, we got to burn it. And while we do that, we don't want to be using anything else for fuel, because our immediate concern is the raising blood sugar, so let's keep the fat stored. So the same hormone is telling your cells to burn carbs and not burn fat, and it's telling your fat cells to store fat. And the way it does it is it upregulates a particular enzyme called LPL that takes fat into the fat tissue, and then it shuts off or inhibits an enzyme called hormone-sensitive lipase, HSL, that breaks the fat down normally and lets it escape into the bloodstream. So as long as insulin's elevated, you're storing fat, burning carbs, storing fat. And all of this is happening while researchers are learning about this condition called insulin resistance, which also took until the 1960s to really measure and identify. So it turns out that if you've got type 2 diabetes or you're overweight or obese, if you've got type 2 diabetes, that's a disorder of insulin resistance. So your cells are not properly responding to the insulin that's being secreted. So as a result, you secrete more of it. And as your insulin is elevated, your fat cells are storing fat. This is all textbook medicine, which is kind of what was so stunning about my research is nobody ever denied any of this. It just wasn't considered relevant to weight loss or weight gain because we knew what made people get fat. They ate too much. We knew what would make them lose weight. They had to eat less. So all this science of fat metabolism and the physiology of adipose tissue, fat tissue, and all this beautiful science was considered irrelevant. The way I phrased it recently in an article is as though researchers decided that the science of fat accumulation had nothing to do with the science of excess fat accumulation, because we know what causes the excess. People eat too much. So what I do in my books, the case for keto is basically if you want to get the fat out of your fat tissue and burn it, you have to lower insulin levels. And for many people, they might have to minimize their insulin. And the way you do that is to avoid carbohydrates and replace those carbohydrate calories with fat, because fat is the one macronutrient that doesn't stimulate insulin secretion, at least in the short run. So the case for keto is basically saying, look, there's a large subset of people that might be, from the overweight to the obese, who if they want to achieve and maintain a healthy weight, and the maintenance is crucial, they don't do it by eating less or eating low-fat diets or purges or, vegan diet. You've got to target insulin and insulin's effect on fat tissue, and you end up with this idea of, the way to do that is to avoid carbohydrates. So you've got a theory that says, look, carbohydrates are literally fattening. Wish it wasn't true. And it's not true for the people who, like the lean people, they can eat them. The rest of us can't. So.
Yeah, that's a really good point. It reminds me of the part in your book where you said, I'm going to probably goof this up, but it was on one page of a medical textbook that talked all about how to, get fat out of the body, yet on an exact same page, it said that fat accumulation is a calorie problem. And it almost, if I'm not mistaken, it never really occurred to the person who wrote it when you interviewed him several years ago. Is that right?
Yeah, this was wasn't actually the same page, same chapter. The sort of leading researcher in fat metabolism or even human physiology, a very, very nice man at Oxford University in the UK who did a lot of this research. And I feel bad targeting these people, but every once in a while, it's like you've just got to make this point on occasion. So I was interviewing him about all of this. This was around 2009. It was for an article I was doing for the journal Science on this insulin resistance condition. And he spent 20 minutes in the interview talking to me about, what seemed like 20 minutes, talking about all the various ways that insulin was the principal regulator of fat metabolism, all the effects it did on different enzymes in the fat cells. And then we got to obesity, and he said, well, yeah, people eat too much. And I said, wait, professor, hold on 1 second. 20 minutes ago, we were talking about what makes a fat cell fat. And it was all insulin, all the different ways that make a fat cell fat. And now we're talking about what makes a human fat. And the obese human is just a compilation of all his overstuffed fat cells. And now suddenly we're talking about this eating too much thing. And these are different mechanisms. We've got the fat cell responding to insulin, but all the fat cells together responding to eating too much. And he literally said, I never thought of that. And they never really did. It was, like I said, from a journalistic perspective, if nothing else, it was stunning. Even if this hypothesis is dead wrong, this idea that since insulin is the principal regulator of fat metabolism, and in order to get fat out of fat cells, the quote from the same 1965 lecture by the people who developed the technology allowing insulin resistance in the body, insulin in the body to be measured. They said, the insulin response, what they call it, the fat cells respond to the negative stimulus of insulin deficiency. That was a technical term, and I use it in the book. That means your fat cells release fat into the bloodstream when they don't see the presence of insulin. So there's another phrase that's used often, even in the journal articles, is that fat tissue is exquisitely sensitive to insulin. If it can detect any insulin at all in the circulation, it's going to hold on to its fat because that insulin is there in theory in response to the carbohydrates that need to be burned, oxidized, used for energy. So if nothing else, this was a viable hypothesis that the principal regulator is insulin. If there's any insulin in the circulation at all, your fat cells are going to hold on to fat. Therefore, there should be a carbohydrate insulin model saying, look, we get fat because the carbohydrates in our diet. And all of this was until the 1960s, the conventional wisdom was that carbohydrates were fattening. Every woman knew this. That was a line that I quote in every one of my books from the 1963 British Journal of Nutrition article written by one of the top 2 dietitians in the UK. And the first sentence was, carbohydrates are fattening. Every woman knows that carbohydrates are fattening, something like that. This is a piece of nutritional wisdom that no one would dispute. They go on to dispute it. But the fact that that was a conventional wisdom until then, and in the 1960s, they actually learned why this could be true. And then they never study it because they know why people get fat, they eat too much.
Yeah, it's bonkers. Why they couldn't even question it, explore it. It's absolutely crazy. It's so crazy.
Well, then there was another thing, getting back to Ancel Keys just for a second. See, that once we embrace the idea that dietary fat caused heart disease, then the idea is we have to eat low-fat diet. So we replace the fat with carbohydrates. So the carbohydrate, which until the 1960s had been considered uniquely fattening, after the 1960s was seen as heart-healthy diet foods. So now, if you examine this possibility that carbohydrates are fattening through their action on insulin, well, you can't do that because we're telling everyone to eat carbs because we think fat causes heart disease. So, and this is the problem with embracing these hypotheses before they're rigorously tested. And once you do, you lock yourself into a whole way of thinking about a whole host of things you never imagined. The diabetes book is basically yet another way that all of this science, pseudoscience I'm discussing, perverted dietary therapy for what's now like 1 in 7 adults. I mean, it's crazy.
Yeah, absolutely crazy. You mentioned earlier people being obese or overweight as, we think of that as it's a willpower problem, it's a character problem. But you talk about something that I thought was absolutely fascinating that never really occurred to me. And it is the cephalic phase of insulin secretion. And, I kind of understood that, but understanding the point that, I can walk through a mall and smell Cinnabon, and it might not really affect me. Where somebody who is overweight, it might affect them completely differently in a way that I could never really experience. Can you talk a little bit about that? I think that was fascinating.
Okay, so there is this concept called the cephalic phase of insulin secretion. You could think of it as the term we're used to think about is Pavlovian responses. So Pavlov's this Russian scientist in the early 20th century who demonstrates that he could train his dogs to associate the ringing of a bell, I think it was, to eating, and then he could ring the bell and the dog would start to salivate. So this is a Pavlovian response. The salivation was preparing the dog for eating, which he now associated with a different phenomenon entirely. So it turns out our bodies do that in a host of different ways. Our bodies, eating food is we've just evolved with very sophisticated, complex, almost miraculous mechanisms to take in this food and process it in a way that maximizes health in the short term and prepares us for any exigencies in the long term. So one of these is insulin secretion. You start thinking about food, you secrete insulin. In response, it's actually, and the way it was first described to me by a famous physiologist, University of California, San Francisco, had done a lot of this work in the early 1960s, is you've got an engineering problem, which is that it takes insulin time to start working on the cells, but the blood sugar starts going up immediately. And once the insulin reaches peak value, it's going to continue working even after the blood sugar starts coming down. So your body, one way your body deals with that is by you start secreting insulin before you eat. So it's already working when the carbohydrates hit the bloodstream and your insulin starts going up, and then you kind of secrete it in pulses so that you never have this problem where you have too much insulin and the blood sugar is already coming down and now you're out of balance. This cephalic phase is interesting because if you're insulin resistant, this condition we talked about where your cells don't respond properly to insulin, which is almost assuredly the case if you're overweight or you suffer from obesity or type 2 diabetes, it's certainly the case, then you're going to oversecrete insulin. And if you oversecrete insulin in the cephalic phase, which is thinking about food, stimulates insulin secretion, and now you oversecrete it, that insulin is going to make you hungry. Basically, it tells your fat tissue to hold on to fat. It tells your lean tissue, your non-fat tissue, to take up blood sugar and burn it for fuel, but your blood sugar is not going up because you haven't eaten yet. So you start emptying the bloodstream of fuels and your cells start to sort of starve a little bit, and your liver probably plays a particular role in here, and all that's going to make you hungry. So now you imagine two people walking through shopping mall. This was the example I use in the book. One is lean and not insulin resistant. The other suffers from obesity and is insulin resistant. And they smell the Cinnabon. Cinnabon is a great example because I'm convinced they have fans that blow the smell of the freshly baked Cinnabon into the mall or the airport or wherever you are, because they know that people are going to smell it and want to eat a cinnamon bun. And this is the some of the physiology underlying that. So the lean person smells the cinnamon bun and he's got this very modest, if at all, insulin response. And it's very easy for him to say, a cinnamon bun, I'm not that hungry. Let's keep going. Now, the person who suffers from overweight or obesity and is insulin resistant has a much stronger insulin response. And that insulin response makes him hungry. And because insulin is signaling the cells to take up carbohydrates and use it for fuel, it actually makes him hungry for carbohydrates. So for that person, he's now in the midst of his, Ansel Keys starvation experiment from the 1940s. And he's getting hungry and hungry, and all he wants to eat is a cinnamon bun. So he goes into the store and eats a cinnamon bun, buys it, walks out of the store. He's eating the cinnamon bun, and some other lean person is walking by thinking, aha, that's why he's fat. He's got no willpower. It's got nothing to do with willpower. It's purely physiological. And one of my speculations, and I can't prove this, is that lean people cannot understand this phenomenon because it doesn't happen to them. Their bodies don't work the way ours do. So it's like the whole concept of willpower is a lean person seeing other people eat and thinking, I don't eat like that, therefore I have better willpower. But they can't understand it because we're not them. Our physiology is different. Our body is responding differently. How that response manifests itself as hunger is different. And unfortunately, it all comes down to this. If you can minimize insulin secretion, which you do by not eating carbs and replacing the calories with mostly fat, then you can slowly fix all this, and then your body will work kind of like a lean person's. And a year from now, hopefully, if that same two people walk through the shopping mall and one of them, was always lean and the other one is newly lean, but now eating a ketogenic diet, the cinnamon bun won't affect him the same way.
Yeah. Wow. No, that's
although bacon and butter might.
Of course, of course. No, that's such a great point. I hadn't really considered that. And it has taken for me personally, and I'm sure you yourself, a very strict, abstinence from carbohydrate to be able to get to that spot, to be able to walk through them all and not even think about Cinnabon. But that's what it takes. I can't have carbohydrates. I can't have sweets. I have to avoid them completely or extremely sparingly and be able to pay the price, because there will be that price. I love that your book is very scientific, but you also did show a few pictures of different plates that were isocaloric, so same calorie versions, but different foods. And you can just look at those foods and see, like, okay, if I eat this, I'm going to be starving in 2 hours. If I eat this, eggs, bacon, whatever you have on there, I'm not really going to be thinking about food at all. And those two things are exactly the same amount of calories. I think most people could understand it.
Well, I think so too, although nobody you're the first person to ever comment on that chapter, which I thought was very interesting. So all I did is I created plates of breakfast plates with a typical American breakfast, cereal, orange juice, toast, and a keto breakfast in in effect, which eggs, bacon, avocado, same calories. And did the same thing with the lunch, although in lunch I went to McDonald's just to make a point. And I got, McDonald's hamburger with the bun and small French fries and a soda. And the keto version was, I think I took the hamburgers off the bun and no fries, no soda. But it ended up the same amount of calories. I forget what the starch was. And dinner was, chicken with mashed potatoes and broccoli for the American chicken, the typical standard American dinner. And the keto version was, instead of a chicken breast, we had chicken thighs and, more broccoli with butter or olive oil on. And you can match the calories exactly. And the meals don't look all that different. And in fact, the keto version of the lunch and dinner, most dietitians, they don't like people eating animal products, but most dietitians would have said this is fine. The only sticking point would have been breakfast, because as soon as you get to eggs and bacon, they start thinking you're killing yourself. But the point is that one of them is a weight loss diet. If nothing else, that 3 keto plates are a weight loss diet, and the 3 standard American diet plates are not. I think the total calories between the 3 meals was around 2,500.
Yeah, that sounds right.
And yet the conventional wisdom is one way or the other. It's always all about calories. And yet here all you had to do was go through that exercise, and you've got a weight loss diet and a weight maintenance diet of exactly the same calories.
Yeah.
The idea of, we should talk about the addiction idea for a second, and not being able to eat carbs. So again, the phrase I use in the book, which I borrowed from what used to be and may still be the most famous book ever written about food. It was called The Physiology of Taste. It was written by a French lawyer turned gourmand called Jean-Antoine Brillat-Savarin. It was published in 1825, the year he died, and stayed in print, has been in print ever after, never went out of print. And Brillat-Savarin said, look, he said he struggled with his weight. And over the course of the 20 years he was collecting research for this book, he had interviews with like 500 overweight and obese people. And he said, they all tell you, ask them what their favorite food is. It's carbs. It's potatoes or bread, or potatoes or bread, or, this was before sugar consumption. Sugar was inexpensive, so he didn't talk that much about sugar, because in the early 19th century it was still kind of a luxury. Although he said, so his conclusion is that people he called it the farinaceous elements of the diet. Farinaceous meant starchy. So the carbohydrates in the diet that cause obesity, he said sugar makes everything worse. And the only solution is more or less rigid abstinence to those foods. Not eating less, not exercising, more or less rigid abstinence to the carbohydrates in the diet. And some of us could get by with less abstinence, and some of us, basically, if we want to maintain a healthy weight, we just can't eat these foods. The same way I use the example of, I had a corn allergy if I was young. If I didn't want to have gastrointestinal problems, I couldn't eat corn. And as I got older, if I don't want to suffer from overweight or obesity, I can't eat carbs in general. I just can't do it. And if I do, not only will I start gaining weight, but I'll start craving them. There's definitely a slippery slope to all this. So part of the problem of therapy. And this book, The Case of Keto, was originally called How to Think About How to Eat, because I just wanted to get people to understand, if you struggle with your weight, this is the way I think you have to think about it. Some of us just can't eat these foods. And the good thing is that when you stop eating them, there's a whole world of foods that you can eat that are delicious, which was the exact same point that Briat Savarin made in 1825. He was perfectly happy not eating bread or potatoes because he could live on all these other wonderful foods, particularly being French, where they had no compulsions against pouring butter sauces on everything.
Yeah, no, that's a great point. I'd love that you went in there. I love the quote that you share. I don't think this is yours. You're quoting somebody when you say, like, whether we think carbohydrates and sugar are addictive or not, we sure act like they do. Or so, I'm paraphrasing. I'm sure I butchered that, but that's right. Like, is it addictive? I don't know. I sure act like it is. I can't stop. If I start, I can't stop.
Yeah, and this is my before The Case for Keto, my last book was a case against sugar, and I had spent years doing research, and I'm buried in the book writing it. And as I'm writing it, I have a very good friend named Charles Mann who goes by Cam, and wrote two famous books, 1491 and 1493, about the Americas before Columbus and then the Americas after Columbus, and it's called the Columbian Exchange. And Cam is a beautiful writer and an extraordinarily thoughtful man. And we had grown up together writing about science, and then he went into more history, and I went into this crazy nutrition world. And so I'm writing a chapter about the first chapter of the diabetes book is just contemplating the possibility that this is an addictive substance. Because when you study how people act around sugar, and when you study how sugar moves through populations and sugary foods, you could imagine it being a drug. And people who have written about it in the past have treated it as a drug similar to many of the other drugs that came out of the Americas around the same time with the colonization of the Americas. And I'm reading Charles Mann, in his book 1493 has a chapter on sugar. And in it, he says, scientists debate today whether or not sugar is an addictive substance, or we just act like it is. And I think this is great, Cam. I've just written 4,000 words, and you said what I'm trying to say in a sentence. This is how good this guy is. And so I quoted his sentence in the book. I couldn't take the 4,000 words out. They're not bad. I still think they make a pretty good introduction. But yeah, I don't know if it is addictive the way we think of it certainly works in the same part of the brain, but it is also a nutrient that works kind of uniquely in the liver. Sugar is sucrose is what's called a dimer. That's a chemical term. It's a molecule of glucose bonded to a molecule of fructose. And the glucose is what starches and grains are made out of and digested into, and they raise blood. It goes from your gut into your circulation and raises blood sugar. The fructose goes through the portal vein to your liver and is mostly metabolized there, the small intestine. And so the other nutrient or calorie compound that's metabolized in the liver is alcohol. And it's interesting, you get similar effects, including fatty liver disease, possibly, and non-alcoholic fatty liver disease, which might be caused by sugar consumption. So it's got interesting, it does things that drugs of abuse, nicotine and heroin and cocaine doesn't, even though it also works in the same part of the brain that they do. So it's can be thought of as addictive. And when I talked about the end of the book, I was a smoker when I was younger, and I tried to quit smoking every day from roughly my 22nd year through my 40th, when I finally succeeded so far. And there's a lot of when I talk about addiction and even abstaining from carbs, a lot of it is based on what I know is possible from eventually winning out over nicotine, which is an extraordinarily potent addictive substance. And when you try to quit smoking, there's a period, for me, the first 3 weeks is just misery. I mean, you're constantly thinking about smoking. It's off. When I lived in New York and I would try to quit, I rarely made it past the first 3 weeks, because if you're walking down the street and you would see somebody smoking next to you, just all too easy to bum a cigarette from them. Finally, I moved to LA, and if you wanted to bum a cigarette, you had to honk your horn and ask them to roll down the window, and that was enough of it. You know, can you throw a cigarette? Anyway, it's the first 3 weeks are miserable. The first 3 months you're just very unhappy. And then the first year, I had actually, by the time I was finally succeeding, I would tell my friends, look, for the next year, I'm probably going to be a not very nice person, and I'm going to apologize in advance if I overreact to things you say, or I, snap at you, or I'm short-tempered, and I just apologize. And then what's interesting is that you get to pass that first year, and you start getting to the point where you can't imagine why you smoked to begin with. And then you get to like year 2 or 3 and you can't imagine ever smoking. That said, my wife is capable of socially smoking cigarettes. So she's the much more fun-loving person than I am. She'll go out with friends. She might smoke a cigarette once every 2 weeks. I'm still convinced if I smoke a cigarette, I'm back to smoking, that the slippery slope. And, I think I know the same is true of sugar and carbs, because I hear it from people all the time, whether it's true for everyone, whether there are people out there who will never get over their cravings. But for the rest of us, it's like, I don't miss eating pasta much as I used to be able to eat 3 pounds at a sitting. I was actually very close to a Sicilian, New Jersey family once, and 3 pounds was a light day for us.
Oh man.
But now it's like, I don't miss it any more than I miss smoking. I might miss smoking more, actually.
Wow. Yeah, that's a story I hear all the time with clients and people that try this way of eating. They go back and kind of think about the things they were eating, and they just lose all their appeal, and they can't imagine why they were so drawn to those foods. But you're right, when you're in the middle of that, that's all you can think about. It just completely commands your attention. Yeah, and I don't think the gist of the transition happens that quickly, but you do, and I talk about this a lot in the book, because I interviewed 120 odd physicians for this book about how they think about this and the challenges to them and their patients. And again, I wanted to get people, sort of teach them not exactly what to eat, but how to think about what to eat. And a lot of them talked about thinking of what they did as a sort of carbohydrate addiction rehabilitation programs, like rehab. And if you can teach people how to eat, you can pretty quickly get them past the point where they are craving these foods and learn. But you also have to, this is a problem with the low fat dogma that we were growing up, and now the sort of plant-based food movement, which is this idea that if you are eating fat, you're killing yourself. I'm still worry about bacon and butter, even though I know the science. And if you're eating animal products, you're killing yourself and harming the environment in a way that's inexcusable with all we know today. And yet some of us might just have to eat that way to be healthy. Yeah, it's tough. It's interesting to grapple with, and it's interesting to consider all those points. And at the end of the day, it's everybody for themselves, because the science is largely ignored, and we're being told all these stories that just ended up not being true. I think it's really interesting, and I don't think you can be interested in the things you've been interested in, obesity, calories, insulin in particular, and not take a really strong interest in diabetes. And so can you tell us a little bit about the new book you mentioned several times? And can you tell us what story were you really trying to tell in this book that you feel like hasn't really been told, enough at this point?
Well, it's pretty simple. So diabetes it's an insulin disorder fundamentally. I mean, that's what type 1 diabetes is: deficiency of insulin secretion, and type 2 diabetes is this condition of insulin resistant where you end up secreting too much insulin. And you're secreting the insulin in response to the carbohydrates in the diet. So you cannot consume carbohydrates without pharmaceutical help to metabolize them safely. If you suffer from type 1 diabetes, you have to take insulin to eat carbohydrates, and they tell you to take carbohydrates, so you cover the insulin. And if you're have type 2 diabetes, you have to take either blood sugar lowering medications or insulin. So we got to this point in America, well, in the world, where by the early 1970s, the prescribed diet for diabetes from the American Diabetes Association was to tell patients to get 60% of their calories from the one macronutrient that they couldn't metabolize safely without drug therapy. And there had always, yeah, it's fascinating. When my book, The Case for Against Sugar came out, or maybe it was A Case for Keto, I can't remember which one. I think it was A Case for Keto. I was interviewed by a reporter for a diabetes website that's based out of Israel. And he was a former chef who became a journalist who was diagnosed with type 1 diabetes. And he told me this story of being diagnosed. Doesn't know anything about this other than that he's now got to take insulin for when he eats carbohydrates. And he says to his physician, who's very well-meaning and very thoughtful, and he said, wait, I don't get it. What you're telling me is that carbohydrates are now a poison to me, and insulin is the antidote. And I'm supposed to eat the poison and take the antidote every day, as opposed to just not eating the poison. And the doctor says, no, you can't think of it like that. And he goes, but that's true, isn't it? And the doctor says, well, yes, but you're not going to want to go through life not eating the poison. And I end up using this conversation as an epigraph, the initial quote in the book, because it nails it so perfectly. So we have a disorder where carbohydrates become poison to people. And as soon as we discover the antidote in 1921, the therapy becomes eat the poison, take the antidote, instead of just not eat the poison. And that's the story I'm telling. And then there's all kinds of interwoven stories about how dangerous the antidote has to be, because the antidote is not being secreted by the pancreas as it is in a healthy human being. It's being injected into an entirely different part of the body. So our body is responding to it even in entirely different ways than it would respond if you get the antidote. So you have all these complications of the disorder, some of which might be due to the poison being consumed and not being well controlled, and some of it might actually be due to the antidote and how that's being metabolized. And yet, because of medical science, and it's not everyone involved is well-meaning and is trying to do the best they can for their patients. But again, it's a story of assuming things to be true without ever really testing them. And so the story, the book is going to end up being a case study in the sort of limits of medical science. I don't know, what percentage of the patients, the people in America who suffer from diabetes will be able to get through it, but it interests me. And so that's the story I'm telling. And I would think that ultimately would have an influence on diabetes therapy, but diabetes therapy is now changing quickly anyway, because the American Diabetes Association, among other organizations, has finally accepted the fact that very low carbohydrate ketogenic diets are exceedingly beneficial for this disorder. Again, if you don't eat the poison, you don't need to take the drugs. It's sort of how, I get it. People like the poison. I understand that, but you stop eating it, you don't miss it. Nicotine, cigarettes are a poison. They cause lung cancer. You stop smoking, you don't miss it after a while.
Yeah, wow. That's so interesting and such an interesting way to look at it. I'm glad you're leading the new book with that. Do you know when that's going to come out?
Maybe a year after I hand it in. So let's hope I hand it in end of the month. I'm close. I'm very close to the end. I just have to keep being productive. And
that's great.
With luck, say spring next year, maybe winter if they decide that every book related to diet has to be published in January.
Good timing.
Yeah.
Yeah, no, that's great. It's such an important story to tell, and so many people that are suffering who don't have that information. So hopefully that gets out there as quickly as possible and helps as many people as possible. And hopefully you get a little bit of time to go back to swimming and can relax a little bit before the next book. You did mention already on the other podcast we did the kind of topic you've been considering for the next book after that. Do you mind sharing what you would like to write about after?
Yeah, the one book I want to write about. So this idea that we get fat because we eat too much, obesity is an energy balance disorder. It's calories in minus calories out. The science is fascinating. The history is fascinating. And the implications, like I said, once you assume that obesity is caused by taking in more calories than we expend, how much you eat and how much you exercise, those are both in effect. Eating too much and sedentary behavior are both behaviors. So as soon as this idea was embraced in the 1930s, a physiological disorder got transformed into a character defect. There's essentially no way to avoid it. And with that character defect comes fat shaming and everything that goes with it, and the complete failure of the obesity research community to solve this problem. So obesity levels just keep getting worse and worse because no one's ever stopped to say, wait, it doesn't have to be caused by eating too much. That doesn't actually make any sense at all. Maybe it's a physiological defect. So I want to write the book, the story of the energy balance thinking. I'll tell the other story clearly in the process. This is in all my other books, but it's very difficult for people to embrace, even when they review the books or discuss the books, because it's so counterintuitive, this idea that people don't get fat because they eat too much, that it really is a hormonal disorder of fat storage. So now I want to write it in a separate book targeted at, basically getting rid of this energy balance thinking forever. And the title, if I have any say in the matter, is going to be the history or the biography or the anatomy, I haven't decided, of a very bad idea. And the subtitle is going to be Energy Balance, Fat Shaming, and the Failed Science of Obesity. And if nothing else, I think I could, and it maybe by then we won't need to do it, wishful thinking, but if people are still insisting that obesity is some kind of energy balance disorder, maybe I can cognitively shame them out of doing that.
Love that. That's great. We will definitely look forward to that. And it's such another needed tune that needs to be written. So really, really appreciate that. If you don't mind, for somebody who is listening to this and maybe hasn't heard of your content, which I don't imagine any of our listeners haven't, but for somebody who hasn't ever heard your content or heard this message before, what is one simple thing you would like them to take away from this conversation and apply in their lives?
Read my books and particularly the Case for Keto, which is as close as I get to a self-help book. If you have trouble controlling your weight, your blood sugar, or your blood pressure, then ultimately you're having trouble metabolizing the carbohydrates in your diet, and you're better off not eating them. And sugar is the first thing that should go.
Yeah. Totally agree. That's great advice. I will second you. For the listener, if you haven't read Gary's works, be sure to read them. There's a certain way that you tell the story. I told Nina the same thing a few weeks ago, that it's a science-based book, but it reads like a thriller. It's you can't put it down. It's not, this boring book about all the numbers and science and everything. It's really enjoyable to read, and it's really fascinating. And you're a fantastic writer and a great journalist for doing all the research, doing all the interviews, and presenting that information in that way that I think people find very engaging and intriguing. So I really do appreciate it. And you've been very generous with your time today. If you could let the audience know, where would be the best place for people to go and find your work and connect with you?
Well, I have a website that I don't keep up enough, GaryTaubes.com, and I tweet at Gary Taubes, that I don't do enough either. Although I think the more you tweet, the more it steals your soul, kind of like people used to think about cameras 150 or 20 years ago. And Amazon, Google. It's one reason I don't keep up the website enough, is because I figure anyone who goes to the website before Google is, but and I do hope to start a newsletter if I can make the time and get the support for it. So I can get this thinking out. There's just a lot of ways to think about these issues, both the nutrition, obesity issues, and science in general, which is my overriding interest, that I would like to have an outlet to talk about without having it be, 3 years a book, no swimming, 3 years a book, no swimming.
Totally. Well, if you do a newsletter, I will be the first one to sign up. I subscribe to very, very few newsletters, but that would be one I would be the first in line to be able to subscribe to that. Gary Taubes,
I may hold you to that.
Please do. And again, in our last conversation, we decided to do a scientific experiment eating steak in New York. So again, if you need people for that cohort, you just let me know. I'll be the first to volunteer.
Okay, terrific.
Gary
Thank
Taubes,
you, Casey.
Thank you very much. It's such an honor to talk to you and really appreciate you and your time today.
Okay.
And this has been another episode of Balanced Body Radio.